things proved to be a bit different. But back to our topic, this shows how civilian leadership is thinking very differently from the military leadership on how wars are fought. And I think it is necessary to look at the background of this notion, because it's not just a British thing, it's, I'm afraid, a very Western thing. So in Western countries, civilian leadership is responsible for quite a lot of things. It is setting strategic aims for the armed forces. It is also setting the budget, which is very important. And usually, civilian leadership is creating the political economic framework for how war can be fought by making legislation on how industry and society should be mobilized when things get difficult. And if I get a bit ahead of me, this is an area in the political sense which was a bit neglected in the last few decades, but I will get back to this later on. Political priorities were in the era after World War II very diverging. So with the advent of nuclear warfare, there was a rethinking of strategy. Before World War II, there was not really difficult thing to foresee what is the worst possibility. It was interstate war, but after the advent of nuclear weaponry, we see a very interesting strategic divergence between civilian and military leadership. Under the nuclear umbrella, during the Korean War, the issue of limited war dawned upon the US Army, for which it was not really that well prepared, because the legacy of World War II was still fresh, total victory on the battlefield, no negotiations, which was, from a historical perspective, pretty atypical, because most wars really do end with some type of negotiation. The Korean War showed how things will be in the next few decades, and even more importantly, the Cuban Missile Crisis created a new system of thinking, especially in the US, because how did the military approach this topic? When the US political leadership asked for options, they presented options which would have led, in the opinion of civilian leadership, to the Third World War. If you have read or watched books and movies about this time, it was pretty intense, and especially how the US Air Force was promoting its vision for warfare was something that has captured the imagination of later generations as well. So what did the political leadership do? They took some of the ideas of the military. They took the idea of the blockade, but renamed it quarantine, and didn't directly attack Cuba, but used armed force in order to prevent the completion of the Soviet missiles. So the use of force was really a bit rethought in this sense from the civilian perspective, and this was something that was not really, well, the generals were usually not really comfortable about this idea. And in the later stages, we see that civilian theoreticians get a very big part of how nuclear theory gets developed, and this will be also a source of animosity, I would say, between civilian and military leadership. What did the nuclear dimension bring along? Well, it brought along the use of proxies and the use of irregular warfare as a means to prevent the outbreak of the Third World War and also probably nuclear war. But at the same time, it was deemed to be an effective vehicle to enhance the interests of the differing sides. So conventional warfare was a bit neglected, although the leadership of the US Army, as later historians and theoreticians point out, wanted to fight a type of a conventional war, for example, in Vietnam. So the air assault tactics that were used in Vietnam were not really developed for the battlefield in Vietnam, but were thought that they could be, or they could play a part on a nuclear battlefield maybe, or in deep operations, which we thankfully didn't see if it had worked out, but the US Army leadership was understanding this conflict as more of a conventional conflict, and the political leadership was forcing upon the military leadership the concept of counterinsurgency. And the military brass was not really happy about it. And if you think about it, they were partially right, I mean both of them, because the Vietnam War can be perceived much more as a hybrid type of threat with today's analytical framework than an insurgency, because there was a North Vietnam which was actively supporting the southern guerrilla movement, and also conventional forces were used from the part of the northern or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But politically, the conflict was pretty much limited because the US leadership didn't want to have an escalation with the Chinese, who were actively supporting the North Vietnamese, and also didn't want to have the Soviets more involved, but they managed to achieve it despite this. So Vietnam was very important in the sense that, at least in the US perspective, the end game was a negative outcome. Because after the US pulled out in 1973, South Vietnam was unable to defend itself. And in 1975, the communist forces won. And this created a soul searching in the US. How can it be that a third world country which had, although very substantial support from the Soviet Union and China and also the Eastern Bloc, was able to defeat the most advanced expeditionary fighting force that the US could muster? And very serious decisions were made in this time. One of them was to professionalize the military, so no national service. What did this achieve? Well, on the one hand, it made the US armed forces much more efficient at what they did. On the other hand, this eliminated a political liability for limited wars, because if everyone serving in the armed forces is by contract obliged to be there and sees this as his or her profession, they won't complain. Then there will not be any protest because of the draft and other things. So fighting small, limited wars with professional militaries is much more efficient. But if you think about how a conventional war is usually going, and Ukraine is a very great example, then we will see that if this gets protracted, and that tends to happen, it will get much more difficult to have the societal mobilization, because only those people will have the necessary training who once professionally served or are in active service, or are reservists, of course. But that will be a limited number. So even in the US perspective, this would be a rather limited number of people who theoretically could be mobilized. And the systems that were created during the Cold War and the previous ages was slowly but surely dismantled. And we can see that from the political point of view, this worked out for quite a while positively for the decision makers, because there was Grenada, there was Panama, there were the Iraq wars, and societal resistance was pretty limited. But this has the cost that in case of a war of national importance, there will be very major drawbacks. Also, it is very interesting to know that on the other hand, the US military has gone back to the basics, and after the Vietnam War, they more or less said that they won't do any similar counterinsurgency or other irregular warfare thingies, and they doubled down on fighting a interstate war with conventional means. And of course, there were many technological improvements during the Vietnam War. Precision weaponry was introduced during these years, the latter years of the Vietnam War. And also research and development of the 5 major systems, which a colleague already talked about, were underway. And the leadership of the US armed forces took some of these lessons of the Vietnam War, also looked at the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, which was the most intense conventional warfare after World War II until that point, and drew up what was also already mentioned, the airland battle concept. So it was very interesting to see that in the 1980s, the US was putting heavy effort practically into this concept, and political leadership was sometimes a bit upset on how the military was trying to sabotage some of the requests from the political staff, because later in the 90s this was a recurring topic, because what they offered was usually to go to war with a country where, when limited options were requested from them. So this was something that had a very long outcome. And at the end of the day, Operation Desert Storm and, to some part Desert Shield, in the eyes of the US leadership, proved that their concepts were valid. If they are given the right tools, the right political authority, they can wage conventional warfare decisively and can contribute to US political aims. And in many respects, Desert Storm was perceived as to be the end of the Vietnam syndrome, so to say. But on the other side, this was, as already was discussed beforehand, not that great, not a victory gained against an experienced opponent, and that somehow, in my opinion, skewed the results a bit that were touted to be as the major advances. So, What happened after the Gulf War? Well, the Soviet Union broke apart. The peace dividend arrived upon us, and this meant major political shifts also in the field of defense. Well, in the case of the US, this meant that many of the infantry divisions and the light forces were disbanded. Much of the logistics was outsourced to civilian contractors, and this, combined with the lack of national service, led to a place where the US Army was very good at fighting limited, or the US Armed Forces in general were very good at fighting limited engagements. But if we look at the Iraq War, they had very major problems of getting the human resources into the armed forces in order to keep up simply the presence. So stop-lossing and making requirements go down was something that was regular in these years. So this showed that even in case of, let's say, lesser conflict, the US had pretty serious problems in managing these types of problems. The other outcome was the so-called defense industrial consolidation, and I've brought a picture from a DoD report, which was from February 2022. And this shows how the US defense industry shrank practically from the 1980s until 2015. As you can see, the number of companies who are playing a part in national defense became less and less. And this was very largely accelerated by the Last Supper, in 1993, in which US political leadership practically signaled to the defense companies that there won't be that many contracts forthcoming, so they should sort it out somehow between themselves who remains in this field. And this led to the emergence of, in most of the fields, to 5 major companies. And what did this also mean? It meant the shrinkage of spare capacity. So in some fields, such as, and this report points this out, that, for example, in the solid rocket fuel manufacture, there are, I think, only 2 companies that are remaining. So, and they have usually very little spare capacity because much of the civilian thinking about logistics, so just in time, very little stocks were built, was taken over because of cost and efficiency issues. And as we see again with the case of the Russo-Ukrainian war, this is not necessarily the best approach. So there is also a major industrial deficiency. And a very similar picture could be also drawn up for Europe, only that the European companies are also competing to a large extent with each other for contracts. And also contracting would be a very interesting issue, but that is not something I'm very experienced in, so maybe other colleagues could enlighten me in this field. So, with these problems, also an over-focus on some technological aspects became also very central, and this is something where the civilian leadership was very forthcoming usually. So having big platforms which are multi-role and have decades-long service time and have specifications which are, when they are proposed, practically impossible to achieve, have become the norm of the defense industry, and cheap, mass-producible items are or were until recently not really on the map. So drone warfare in the Ukraine brought a refreshing breeze in this field, so to say. But if you look at the Western approach to drone warfare, it was also dominated by larger multi-role platforms. Yeah, and last but not least, before I forget it, the misunderstanding of the nature and characteristics of warfare was something that, especially with the civilian leadership, was a recurring problem. So a more benign war was promised in the 90s and early 2000s, where precision weaponry would be able to make a cleaner, more just war, which was simply not achievable. Because until the nature of war will be that one group of people forces another group of people to do something or live in a way that they don't want to, violence against people will have to remain a central part of warfare. And this didn't change in the last few centuries when I last looked. But the characteristics, because of technology, have changed immensely. And there was an inflation or confusion between the two things, especially in civilian leadership. So, what are contemporary problems? I would say that one major problem is a cognitive problem, especially on the civilian side, also regarding the nature and characteristics of warfare, but not only. The over-focusing on the technological aspect would be something that I would point to as not really healthy in many discussions. And also, I would say that political leadership right now tends to look at warfare as just another crisis to be managed. And I often don't see the long-term approach, because as much was lost in the last few decades because of the trends I've tried to list, in many cases, I don't see a realistic approach to rebuild these. For example, there is a lot of talk that Europe should produce more ammunition, but in the first year of the Ukrainian war, I don't recall that too many new ammunition factories were initiated, but that would have been needed to have more ammo available as of today, for example. So this long-term thinking is something that is, I think, still somewhat missing, because in the military industrial capacity building, you can't have something ready by tomorrow. It takes a lot of time, investment, and especially because systems have become extremely complex and many different companies have to do the building and even more the R&D. It has become immensely more complicated than, for example, during World War II. If we think about how in World War II a few technicians were able to keep one plane flying, well, that is impossible today. And things have simply become too complicated in this sense. And also, in wider society, there is a danger of misunderstanding on how war and peace works. And if we look at, for example, the current gains of the BSW in especially Eastern Germany, then we can see that this is very much a current and present danger. Creating priorities which are straightforward and preparing the population for a possible conventional war is something that has not really been done in the last few decades, I'm afraid. So having a realistic talk in the wider society would be necessary. However, there are really big problems because as we have seen, the issue of war and peace became very dogmatic in many places, so I'm not really seeing an easy answer to that. And also creating resiliency in societies is working in places where threats were perceived in the last few decades. For example, the Baltics and in Scandinavia, this, as far as I'm aware, is working pretty well. But in the rest of Europe, I would say not so much. So there is plenty of work to be done in this regard. Also, how the US and Europe can strengthen structures is also from the point of view of the armed forces is a very important topic which should be talked about, but is not really up on the map, so to say. Such more forgotten topics like civil defense in Europe, that has pretty much gone into, I don't know, absent without leave. I can tell one example how much this was neglected. In Budapest, the metro line 4 was completed about 10 years ago, if memory serves me well, maybe somewhat more. But what struck me when I first went there is that it's very shallow and the stations have glass ceilings when you go up the elevator. So they are absolutely useless for any type of civil defense. As the older metro lines were built, especially with this in mind, they were deeper, they were conceived as a civil defense measure, as in many Western capitals and also eastwards. And as we see in Ukraine, it works pretty well for them in many places. There are very difficult questions which need to be asked but are not really, in many societies, are being asked, like how can, or is it possible even to reintroduce national service? I'm not really sure about that, but we have some interesting examples. I was at a conference in March, I think, in Poland, and I was a bit surprised to hear that, for example, the peacetime movement, and by that the preparations inside Europe for military goods and equipment is a pretty bureaucratic thing. And considering that the possibility of a conventional war is not that distant right now, this would be also a thing that could be thought over in more detail in the near future. So I didn't look at the time, but I hope that I wasn't too short. Okay, then I'm looking forward to your questions, and I hope that I could get some interesting points to you. Thank you very much.